Where did life come from? It's one of those big questions that still hasn't been answered really satisfactorily. Of course, there will be some people who disagree with that. The young earth creationists, or creationists in general, who think they do have an answer to this question. Their answer to this question is, God did it. It's a little bit sad, really, if you think about it. In actual fact, using that as an answer is quite insulting to the very God that these people claim to believe in. At the very least, they would say that basically, after pulling off a feat as impressive as creating the universe in all its magnificence, God didn't see fit to harness that universe's potential and let it create life for itself, but it had to resort to magic tricks. That's not very impressive, in my book. But also, it shows a remarkable lack of curiosity of those people. Even if you do believe that God did create life, to show absolutely no interest to find out how God exactly did this. What processes did God use? By what mechanism did God manage to give rise to life? To show no interest in that whatsoever is pretty sad, really. And the answer is not in the Bible or in the Quran either. If you look at those books, it might say something about creation, it might say something about where life came from, which is of course wholly inaccurate, but even if it were accurate, it would be at the very best extremely sketchy. And you would expect that somebody who really wants to know would be curious as to find out more about the detail, about how exactly did this happen. And to show no interest in that whatsoever is pretty strange in my book. The main objection that many a religious person would bring up against abiogenesis would be to point out that never has it been observed that non-life gives rise to life. Of course, the problem there is that this is a clear example of very dichotomous thinking. In their minds, the world is very easily divided into things that are alive and things that are not alive. That might seem obvious, that might seem very straightforward and self-evident to the casual observer, but it's not. And the first inkling as to why you're barking up the wrong tree when you take that attitude is to start thinking about how you would define life. Don't even try, because people have been trying for ages and ages and ages and failing miserably. Every time somebody tries to define life, they find that their definition would include things that we would clearly not see as alive, or it would exclude things that we would clearly think are alive. No definition can cover exactly our dichotomy of things being either alive or not. There is always that grey area in between that simply does not allow itself to be pinned down by definitions like that. And that would be the first inkling as to how there could be a solution to this particular problem. Because if there is a grey area in between the two extremes, if there is not just non-life and life, but the whole murky, undecided wasteland in between, then you can start realizing, then you can start conceiving of the possibility that there might be a path from one extreme to the other through the grey area in between. And that would be the first inkling to the fact that maybe this is not as miraculous as you might think. Now, given the fact that we now realize that there may be a path leading from non-life to life, for the simple reason that there is this whole grey area in between that could, conceivably at least, be traversed, we might want to start thinking about how this may have been traversed. The answers are not out there yet. We are still trying to figure out how this may have happened. But we have some ideas. We have certain ideas that might give us a clue as to how we might have gotten from point A to point C and what points B might have lied in between. First of all, let's just look at a world, let's imagine a world that is purely chemical in nature. So there's no life on this world. All that is happening is that the world is full of chemicals, as every planet would be. And of course, these chemicals are constantly reacting with each other. They are doing whatever chemicals do. Well, there are such things in chemical reaction as catalysts. And catalysts are very interesting things. They have a tendency of participating in chemical reactions. Chemical reactions have an input of a certain amount of chemicals and an output of a different set of chemicals. But catalysts are funny in that regard, because what happens is that as you start a process, you have this chemical that's a catalyst in the reaction, and at the end of the process, the chemical comes out unscathed. It is still the same chemical. During the reaction, it may have changed significantly and may have been used, but the output of the reaction contains the same chemical that went in, plus of course all the other chemicals that have changed. So that is the first indication of how a replicating mechanism may have come into being, because there are certain chemical reactions that not only use catalysts, but in actual fact produce more of the catalyst during the process. Those chemical reactions would be like chain reactions and could run out of control if enough other chemicals are present, or they could just slowly take over. But there's one very important aspect of these chemical reactions. First of all, they are continuously engaged in a feedback loop with the environment. The catalyst interacts with other chemicals in the environment, does its thing, comes out again, and it replicates itself. But the important bit is that it is already engaged with no intention there whatsoever. It's just chemicals and what these things do. It's engaged in recruiting other chemicals in its environment in order to produce more of itself. That is what is happening if you were to be able to look at things from the catalyst's perspective. Now imagine chemical reactions that can have several different catalysts, and certain catalysts are more successful at facilitating these chemical reactions and producing more of themselves. That is a form of competition and a form of natural selection in effect already. But also imagine chemicals that have the property that they can recruit other chemicals in their environment in order to protect themselves from, say, corrosive chemicals that would end up destroying them. We are starting to see an awful lot of aspects of what we commonly see as aspects of life already coming into force here. Now realize that we're talking about something that has had hundreds of millions of years to perfect itself, simply by bumping into the right chemicals at the right time, slowly but steadily, finally, eventually, becoming more and more sophisticated. Not because of any goal-driven mechanism, but simply because any time it chanced upon something that worked better, that is what became ubiquitous, and the rest fell by the wayside. That is natural selection in action from the very start. Before you know it, you'd start using lipids, for example, creating membranes protecting chemical reactions from taking place in a hostile environment, and so on and so forth. Slowly but steadily we start seeing gradually coming into place things that we might start recognizing as cells, for example, and things that we start recognizing as something that we would consider alive. Now this is, of course, a very, very simplistic representation, but it gives you an outline of how this may have happened over an immense time span. It's not like some of the creationists would have you believe, that one day, out of the blue, popped into existence a single eukaryote cell. No, that's definitely not what happened. And anybody who tells you that that is what science would claim is telling you a lie.